I'm Grant Keddie. I was the curator of archaeology at the Royal BC Museum for 50 years, from 1972 to 2022. And now I'm retired and still have a passion for archaeology. Well, when I first came to the museum, part of my job was to answer all the public inquiries. And back in those days, there was no such thing as email, and it was all letters and telephone calls. And I got a bit of a shock one day when a local teacher phoned me up and they asked me, could I tell them when the indigenous people in this area became extinct? And that kind of threw me off a bit. I couldn't believe that this was a question I was getting asked by a teacher. So I really saw it as my duty to go out to schools, and I gave slide talks and did my tool technology demonstration, making ancient stone and bone tools. And I went to that woman's class first of all, and then tried to provide them with background information. But unfortunately, there was just very little information available about local First Nations that was anywhere accessible for people. So I made numerous visits to schools all over the place, literally from kindergarten to grade 12, and also the university, trying to enhance Indigenous cultures in the minds of the public. That's always been my objective. How can we enhance the Indigenous cultures in the minds of the public, and make people think about, the more they know about First Nations culture, the more they're going to treat them more with respect. And that was always been my objective. Now, later on, 1972, Chief John Albany of the Songhees came to the museum, and he's saying that the young people were not learning about their culture. Could we do something with them to help them learn about their culture? So that launched a 2-year project where we signed an agreement with them as to how we're going to cooperate and work together. And the people employed would be lots of teenage students that were on the Songhees Reserve at that time, plus some from a few other reserves. Now, John Albany had previously worked with the museum in the 1960s, working with Wilson Duff, the museum's director, and George Cloutessy, who's a New Channel person. And they had a prize-winning CBC radio show called The Way of the Indian. And in that show, they talked about what life was like on the reserves, and talked about schools and all the things we're hearing about today. They were the first ones to go on to national radio station and talk about this kind of stuff. And so Chief John Albany had already developed this trust relationship with us and was very enthusiastic about working with us, doing excavations, and us exchanging information regarding their culture. Now, that eventually led to, after the 2 years was up, we did it for another 2 years, and then we did winter works projects and other things. So there was a time when most of the teenagers on the Songhees Reserve were involved somehow in one of those projects during that particular time period. So many of these teenagers are now elders, so they know about archaeology. Yeah, we're in the back of Esquimalt Harbor, and this is an archaeological site that archaeologists label DCRU 42. This is a shell midden that has about 2 meters of deposits in it. We've never dated it, we don't know very much about it, but what's really fantastic is this is preserved in a park. And the local First Nations, because of the massive eroding that was gone at the site, arranged with the local municipality to put hundreds of tons of gravel down here and cover up the exposed areas. We had people sort of looting this site, digging into the bank. So that problem was solved with the First Nations working with the local community. So this is one of many sites that we know very little about in the greater Victoria area. So what I'm interested in, and what more and more First Nations are telling me they're interested in, is where did they utilize the landscape in the past? So you got places like this that was probably a permanent winter village of some kind. There are a number of these larger sites that we know very little about. Many of them have been seriously destroyed over the years, and still are being so. The kind of archaeological work done is often minimal on these particular locations. But there are many, many small sites all over that were probably seasonal campsites. So the First Nations are interested, where did they do all their fishing? Where did they do all their hunting? Where did they all do all their plant collecting? So this is the kind of information we can put together. And as archaeology becomes more sophisticated, where we're now doing all kinds of isotope analysis and DNA analysis, we can start to look at the bigger pattern of, in addition to people using the landscape, what were their relationships with their neighbors? So we can look at trade items. So we know that people in this area were getting jade or nephrite celts from the Lower Fraser. So obviously that's evidence that they were trading with these people over in the Vancouver area north of there, up in the interior, going back at least a few thousand years. So there are many things we find in these old sites that talk about connections between Indigenous people in the past. There's no record of this as being occupied by Indigenous people in historic times. This is a rather interesting site. His Chief Ron Sam Songhees was down here one day and actually found a whalebone club eroding out of the bank. So it's just, these things are extremely rare. They're scattered out sites in the greater Victoria area. Most of them never dated because they often found when people are destroying sites or they're eroding out of the side of the sites. So we'd be able to go and look at thousands and thousands of animal bones that are buried in the site. So be able to tell what kind of animals are they hunting here, where did they come from, what other kinds of evidence is there in this site, to look at the bigger picture of how local Indigenous people were using the resources and how they were communicating with Indigenous people outside of their traditional territory. So many of the old articles people don't read anymore, so I'm putting a lot of my older articles on. And then there are many things that I've been thinking about all my life where I've accumulating information on a particular topic, and now I want to write it up from my perspective. So when it comes to museum collections, it's very important to know who are the people that collected those. Most things in museum collections came from private individuals who had collections, people that were given things as gifts. So for example, somebody comes in, they donate a basket to the museum. It was given by a First Nations group, by her mother was a school teacher. When she left, they gave her this as a gift. So this is many of the things in our collection are these kind of things given as gifts in the past, things that were in maybe 5 or 6 different collections over the last 60, 70 years. And it's important to know who collected them, where did they collect from, what does it say in the museum catalog. And again, these are also things that we can study with new technology to find out where they came from. So the vast majority of baskets, for example, we unfortunately do not have the name of the Indigenous woman who made those baskets, which is really, really too bad. But most of these were things made for sale, put in stores in Lillooet and Vancouver and Victoria, and sold to Europeans. And now, if we can't identify these, maybe we can do special DNA isotope analysis and be able to show you where did the trees come from that made that basket. So you can't, often the design elements are something that you really can't link to a specific particular population. So there's so many of these things in the museum collection that have been preserved in the past can open up a whole new world of new information that Indigenous people will be interested in. And when it comes to the whole question of repatriation, we'll have better information as to specifically where these things came from. Can we link them to particular populations in various parts of the province? One of the museum's biggest collection was by Charles Newcomb and his son William, that eventually was donated to them. He collected things from museums all over North America, but eventually all their wonderful collection came to the museum in 1960, and it's well documented. So he has receipts, all the money he bought many of these things from Indigenous people, and we have the receipts in the archives, what he paid various people for it, or who he contacted to acquire these artifacts in the first place. But often there'll be artifacts that somebody drew a picture of or made comments, say 150 years ago, but none of them are left anymore. So he would find an elder who remembered as a child how things were made and get them to make a model for them, just like the knowledge they put into these houses, those are people that were, when they made those Haida houses, well, those are people that were actually part of that culture and had that knowledge, but a lot of that's lost in other areas. So it was wonderful to try to put together, find these people that at least knew something about those objects that were made that were no longer in existence. And one of the person that did the best job of doing this was James Tate, who was a great supporter of Indigenous rights, who took Indigenous people to Ottawa to fight for their rights. And he organized, he had intermarried into the Spence's Bridge band, and he got his relatives to get old, worn out things and rework them, or make new things that they remembered when they were younger. So you're reconstructing clothing as it used to be, using the people who had the knowledge of how it should be made and how it should look. And that's the museum, a lot of that ended up in the museum collection. Yeah, I'm very interested in all human beings and where they came from and moved and shifted all over. Human beings have always been on the move. Sometimes they're stable for a few hundred years here or there, but they're moving and mixing with other groups. You have major environmental disasters. We assume that diseases didn't come into the New World until after Europeans came, but that's not true. We know diseases were here long before that. If you had a smallpox in Japan in the 4th century AD, well, we know they were trading with the people in the Kuril Islands, who were trading with people in the coastal Siberia, who were trading across to the Inuit on the other side. Did diseases come here, say, in the 4th century and kill off large numbers of people? You know, so there's so much we don't know about human history. When you look at the enormous number of different languages, mutually unintelligible languages spread all on the coast of Alaska and British Columbia, there obviously was some big changes that happened in the past. You've got movements of people into the territory of other people, but a lot of it's probably to do with intermarriage, mixing and matching. So when I look at my own history, I say, well, all 4 of my grandparents were Scottish, but now I know from my DNA that the DNA that I hold inside me, my mitochondrial DNA, comes from a Pictish woman. It's a match for a Pictish woman in a cemetery dating to the 6th century. So, gee, do I call myself Pictish Scottish now? And again, what's going on there? Well, we know the Pictish people were a vibrant culture from 300 to 900 AD. Then they seem to have disappeared and all these myths created about them. But we know they didn't disappear. They were intermixed with the more dominant Scots culture coming into the area, and a lot of the devastation caused by the Vikings. So those ancestors are still here. So I'm a mixed bag of a number of populations, but if I go back before that, I'm a mixed bag of other mixed bags, and I go right back to where my ancestors were in Siberia 20,000 years ago. Things that I'm continually, my DNA is a product of continual mixing and matching with different populations over many thousands of years. There's so much more we have to learn, and I'm hoping that more and more younger First Nations go to university and get into training, work with their elders, and start asking these questions themselves that they want to answer.